Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks so much for the invitation, for allowing me to speak a little bit about open innovation, which is my main research topic, which I think is a very important innovation practice for many companies worldwide. And I would like to just take a bit of your time to explain, what is open innovation, how have we looked at it from a in our research, and then hopefully we can have also a discussion about how it links to themes like grand challenges and other things. So maybe I just start a little bit, a few words about myself, and I believe I was introduced before, but my Turkish is a little bit rusty, so I'm not exactly sure what was mentioned. But let me just briefly say that I originally studied at the Eindhoven University of Technology, and quite proud to say, actually, since 2-3 months now, I'm actually back at the professor as a professor of open and collaborative innovation at the place where I was once a student. So that is a great experience in itself, and very humbling. In the meanwhile, after I studied here, I did my PhD in management of technology at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne, EPFL, and I worked quite many years in Denmark, where last 5 years I was a professor of innovation entrepreneurship at the University of Copenhagen, where I'm still affiliated. And as I believe was maybe also mentioned, at least I heard some of the keywords passing by, I'm also affiliated currently with the Garwood Research Center as a research fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. So in terms of my my research interest is mostly about open innovation and things like business models and ecosystems and how it all relates to grand challenges. And I'm happy that I'm able to share a few things about how I look at some of those things. So when I talk about open innovation, I really like to show this quote from quite a while back, which was actually in this original book called Open Innovation by Henry Chesbrough, that really, I think, spurred a lot of interest in this domain, both in practice and also in our research. And the quote here is that not all the smart people in the world work for your company, right? So and for me, it's quite a powerful quote, because it does capture to some extent really the essence of what open innovation is about, because it's really about the fact that you can do a lot of things in-house, and even if you're very innovative organization, there's still so many smart people out there, right? So there's a lot of innovation potential, to be drawn from if you look outside of your organizational boundaries. And this has become even more important in the last few decades, I would say, and that's also been studied increasingly by many colleagues. It has become more important because people move from job to job more quickly. Role of universities has changed, also become really important. The availability of knowledge, globalization of knowledge has really increased. There has been an expansion of venture capital, which also allowed to let certain ventures grow outside of the original organizational boundaries. And of course, the internet and information and communication technologies have really enabled the opportunity to tap into all these smart people out there. Before I say a little bit more about how we have looked at this topic of open innovation in the research and present you a kind of a framework, I just want to start with this story. It's one of my favorite examples of open innovation, one of the early examples, and I'll tell you in a minute why this is also one of my favorite examples. It is the example of Procter & Gamble, that back in the days, the story goes is that they are producing this Pringles product. So it's kind of this snack, chips-like product, where the idea was that, wouldn't it be nice if we could print some sort of, like a cartoon or a quiz on this product. So this was perceived to be a really interesting idea. And then the research and development, the R&D department, tried to, with a lot of smart people working there, really tried to solve a solution. And they had, many options, but they apparently couldn't really tackle the, the exact solution. And you can imagine, I mean, this is an edible product, right? So it has to be really at a certain level to be able to introduce such a technology on a product that people will eat. But instead of then sort of giving up on the idea and putting it somewhere on the shelf, they basically decided to reach out to their external partners, their network of people out there, to see, is there maybe somebody who can help us to solve this problem? And then it turned out, long story short, that some university professor who happens to also own a bakery, I believe in Bologna in Italy, actually already had a solution for this particular problem. And that meant that at the fraction of the time and the cost it would have taken Procter & Gamble, they were able to insource this solution from that person in Italy and actually launch a successful product. Now, the reason why this is one of my favorite examples is, well, first of all, because it was a university professor who came up with the solution. So this is important to remember that, sometimes people like me, being professor at university, we can actually, help with real life problems. But the other reason, of course, is that it really shows, the potential of leveraging, say, all those smart people out there, and there only has to be one with a particular solution. If I can, give another example, and I like to give the example of Lego, which is the Danish toy manufacturer, because I worked many years in Lego, and my kids played a lot with Lego, of course, at the time. But it's a very interesting company, also from an open innovation perspective, because they've really embraced the fact that external people and in particular users can help them to develop their product, so to say. So one early example is this Lego Mindstorms product, which is basically a combined hardware software toolkit to build your own robot. So the story goes that when they launched this product initially, that against their expectations, somehow a whole bunch of users started to basically say hack into the product, right? So they started to tinker with it themselves. So in the end, I believe that they were not quite sure how to react to it, but in the end they basically embraced this idea of their users actually also building communities around this particular product. But also making adjustments to the product and ultimately also co-creating the offering that Lego had. So and by embracing that and by really allowing and facilitating those user communities, they were really able to actually have a very successful product. Now the other example is more recent. This is Lego IDs, which basically is what we would call now a crowdsourcing platform. So here the idea was that basically anybody can submit an ID for creative, innovative design of a Lego product, and if there's enough support for that product, that Lego will essentially also produce that particular product. And this turned out to be quite a successful idea, and we have seen it, of course, many other examples of these sort of crowdsourcing platforms, where anybody can really submit their ID and as such develop interesting products. So the final example I want to give is the one of Philips, and this is a company that is originated in Eindhoven, which is actually the area where I'm now working, and probably without this company there would not be a university here, one may even argue. But anyway, the why this is an interesting company is because they also explicitly embraced open innovation over the years in their innovation strategy. So what they describe also is that on the one hand they do what they also call inside out innovation. So they make their skills and resources available to the outside world. So this is about, they mean like contact research and providing facilities, and also very much IP licensing. So they have a big intellectual property portfolio, and they want to make that available, of course, in a way that they can also benefit from it. On the other hand, they describe they do outside-in innovation, which is really drawing on capacities of individuals, organizations, and small startups from around the globe. So really trying to leverage all those smart people out there and try to see how they can use that to accelerate their innovation process. So what that looks like in a sort of graphical form is we often describe open innovation, through this sort of funnel model. So if you look at a firm or any organization, maybe as a funnel where you have all kind of internal ideas and an internal knowledge base, and there's a whole process, of course, through which innovation projects would ultimately end up in new products or services in the current market. Open innovation really is about how can I open up these organizational boundaries, and how can I, on the one hand, use this outside-in perspective. So really, like Procter & Gamble, found this person who had the solution, or like Lego is doing with their users and with crowdsourcing. Try to really leverage all these external sources of knowledge. At the same time, you can also think of the inside-out perspective, which is really about how can you leverage your internal knowledge or technology base by tapping into external partners that in that sense allow to find new markets in ways that you would not be able to do yourself, as is, for example, the case in Philips. And in fact, Philips is also a company that has been well known for sort of more going into collaborations, co-creation, and alliances, which may be captured in a coupled mode of open innovation, because in many cases you need a kind of back and forth combination of outside in and inside out knowledge flows in order to really develop products in a way that you would not be able to do as an independent organization. So how do we then define open innovation? Well, we would describe it as, it's a distributed innovation process. So that's, again, all those smart people out there, all that knowledge for innovation is available throughout the world. But then this is based on purposefully managed knowledge flows across organizational boundaries. So again, it's the funnel, it's the organizational boundaries that need to be open. You need to get knowledge in or push knowledge out in order to accelerate innovation processes. And you can use different mechanisms for that. So it can be pecuniary mechanisms, so like money you would pay for licensing fees, for example, or non-pecuniary, which would be things like also intrinsic motivation. So the fact that a person may really like the fact that their design is picked up by a company and ultimately produced, even without considering the monetary benefit. And then in the end, it's all in line with the organization business model. And this basically means that it has to fit with the logic in which they create and capture value. And the point here really is that if you move from a closed to an open business model, on the one hand, it's about creating new revenue streams, especially through inside-out open innovation, but also to really sort of accelerate innovation processes and lower cost and time that you would normally spend on innovation projects by basically leveraging all the external development that is available. Now, this, of course, sounds all really, really good and great, but there are also limits to this kind of model. So a very well-established finding in the literature that has been quite well replicated as well is the fact that if companies open to multiple external sources of knowledge, which you can see across this axis here. So if a company opens up to more different types of external sources of knowledge, ultimately their innovation performance will go up. So they will basically be able to develop more new products that are coming from these external or driven by these external sources, and they will be able to sell more innovative products relative to old ones. But as you can see here also that at some point, this effect actually goes down. And this is, of course, because it becomes more difficult to manage all these external sources. And at some point, that becomes sort of too much and too costly in a way that the innovation performance actually goes down. So, this kind of idea also really triggered us to think of, okay, what is then actually the process with which companies, try to leverage external sources of knowledge? And based on the, literature, we've been able to identify a couple of phases in a process model that allow companies to go through these or to really leverage external sources of knowledge. So what we found is that one way to look at it is that you should start with how do you actually obtain knowledge coming from the outside. So what are the sources of innovation? But then how do you integrate it into your company, where you consider what your company actually looks like, what their characteristics are, and so on. And then how do you finally commercialize it and put something useful to your customers? And we also identified several interaction mechanisms in this sense. So let me just sort of briefly walk through this model before sort of concluding, and then opening up for the discussion if there are any questions. So the first stage here is this sort of obtaining phase, and actually we know quite a lot about it. I gave some examples, like with Lego and crowdsourcing, and you can use different kinds of toolkits and platforms and other ways to search and find external knowledge. So this is actually often not the problem. The problem really comes in the next phase, which is when you need to integrate it into your organization. And here we see many issues about companies not having the absorptive capacity, not having the knowledge really to understand the ideas that are coming from the outside, or they may lack the right culture. They may have this not invented here culture where it's about, well, I'm supposed to be the one who's innovative, and I don't really want to work with external ideas. But this, of course, should be changed to what sometimes is called a proudly found elsewhere culture. So actually the willingness, to really embrace external ideas. And there are all kind of other issues in terms of what are the incentives, what are your competencies? Can you really, work with external knowledge as you have done with internal knowledge as well? And again, and as I mentioned, sort of how do you ultimately commercialize it, which is very much about, what does the commercialization process really look like? How do you appropriate the benefits from it? And the role of the business model is really critical in this sense as well. How do you create and capture value by working with these external knowledge sources as well? Then we also identified some interaction mechanisms, which is really about, well, it's not in the end a very linear process. These sort of processes go up and down also in that funnel from inside to outside. There are many, interactive, co-creation, networks, community aspects that are also really important that of course, complicate a little bit what the process looks like. So what we can learn from that kind of research, I think one thing is that it's really important that we have a more complete understanding of open innovation also within this process, so that we understand it's not just about getting the knowledge in, but how can you really work with it, integrate it, and ultimately commercialize it. It's also very much, I think, about how do you really use this idea of the business model? How does the fact that you want to work with external knowledge sources fit with the way that in which you want to create and capture value? And how can you even measure those kind of things? I think that is often really still a problem in many companies as well, because you want to develop also the KPIs to know whether something is a successful approach or not. And the final point here is that, as I mentioned, it all looks all great on paper, but where are the limits? Where are the decreasing returns, the cost, the risks? When does this open innovation logic really breaks down? What do we know about failures? When it doesn't really work out well, we don't really know so much about it, because it's also difficult to study them, of course. And in the end, it's really about how what things are working together, and what are the ultimate, what are the boundary conditions? What are the conditions under which an open innovation approach works better or worse? I think these are really some of the key questions that allows us to understand under which conditions open innovation really works well or not, and to really understand what we may call the micro foundations of open innovation. So how does it all work when you go in inside the organization in terms of how do individual level characteristics, the background of employees really help or hamper a firm to be open for innovation. Now, then, to conclude, I just wanted to say that, in the end, what I think is an important topic is that we should see, open innovation, of course, as we can look at firms that have certain structures and processes inside their organization. But we also need to consider what I call this micro foundation. So what is happening inside the organizational, individual level, project level, how does it all relate to innovation culture and so on? But also, how does it connect to higher levels of analysis? Because especially when we want to address some of the more complex challenges, no single organization can do that. And we also in the beginning, mentioned this idea of grand challenges. So grand challenges are very, complex challenges in an uncertain context, very sort of ill-defined, where, we need to find approaches in which different organizations can work together, but it has major implications, because it means you're not only managing your own organization and innovation process, but you kind of co-manage other organizations, innovation processes and business models as well, and you have a lot of interdependency in the networks and ecosystems that you work in. So I think this is really an important topic for us as researchers, but also in practice when we want to address some of the larger challenges. So that's kind of the background that I wanted to sketch, and with that I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm open for any question or other kinds of discussion, and looking forward to it.
Dear Marcel, thank you for the presentation. It was I think it was a great introduction to open innovation. I mean, I assume that people know about open innovation, but they didn't know the theory behind, and you did a great explanation. I would like to talk to you about the grand challenges. I mean, you finished with that, but before, there is a question regarding the topics that you discussed, which is a very relevant question to our times. One of the listeners is asking, how can open innovation contribute to the survival of SMEs during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Okay, yeah, that's a very it's kind of a big question, but I think an important one. So, and I'm not going to say I have a straight answer to that in a way, but I think it's a relevant question. So in general, I think it's really important to consider, that open innovation may also work differently for different types of companies. So, and of course, we've also seen that in our research, that it works, in a particular way for large companies where a lot of the research has focused on, but in the context of small and medium-sized enterprises, the processes may be also fundamentally different. Also, a generic answer is that what we have seen is in general, open innovation can be quite important for SMEs under certain conditions. The point in general is also that you need to look for also maybe what we call the sort of complementary assets of other organizations. So as a small company, of course, you have particular capabilities. So there's something you're really good at, but you can often not really develop a holistic solution by yourself, and you need to look at, okay, how can I actually collaborate with other companies that have these complementary assets that complement your capabilities in a way that together you can really provide that offering that allows you to really let your knowledge, your technology shine, so to say. And we've also seen that there are differences, in terms of sort of new ventures and established SMEs, in terms of the relative importance of working with external knowledge or developing in internal R&D and so on. Now, that's a very generic answer that hopefully gives some hooks to think about. But in the sort of phase of the COVID-19 pandemic, I would say that obviously it's highly challenging for many reasons, unfortunately. But part of the answer may lie also in this fact of trying to see where do the new opportunities lie. So where can you really put your capabilities at work in the sort of the new pandemic economy or post-pandemic economy, and I think that's maybe a critical way to find the strength of your company in the sort of the new economy that is arising. So if of course you see that your existing business model and industry is not really working anymore, so what is it where you can have a contribution? And then I think this general story that I tried to say before does really come into the picture, because then it's about, okay, how can you collectively or collaboratively with other organizations develop new solutions that actually maybe specifically fit with the current era that we are living in. So in that sense, I think it's about adjusting the business model, trying to see which potential external partners may allow you to do that, and potentially looking for what are the new problems and the new challenges that are emerging that you can actually have a contribution to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Marcel. Actually, there are so many questions. I mean,
okay.
there are so many questions coming. I don't know if you'll have enough time to reply. One other question is, do you have some best practices to promote prone to found elsewhere culture?
That's also a very good question. So, I mean, the notion of culture is, of course, a tricky one in the sense it's not something that you can change overnight. It's something that really develops over a long period of time. So, best practice in terms of, okay, what you can do Monday morning is kind of is actually difficult in the sense that you should also see it as a long-term development and investment. That said, of course, I think there are, of course, ways to work towards that, and also to, on a more short-term, develop, kind of maybe a climate for openness or something like that. And I think the key realization that I've also seen in many other companies is that that you also need to be and sometimes companies call it like this also, you need to be open on the inside as well. So you need also internal openness in terms of, organization or, different functional areas communicating to each other. You need a kind of a way of working in which people embrace sharing of knowledge, even internally, with colleagues, so to say, and with colleagues in the same department, in other departments. So that, in my view, is one of the key things. Try to make sure that your internal organization is favoring also knowledge sharing, and has that kind of, can develop that kind of culture. And that is one thing that I've seen, and we know from the literature also, that can allow you to really work well with, or to develop this proudly found elsewhere culture. Yeah.
Marcel, actually, there are other questions, but I would like to ask a question of mine that we have just discussed previously. Sure. So you have connected open innovation to grand challenges. So grand challenges is also emerging as a new outlet for open innovation. And you said that, some firms are now coming together to tackle with those grand challenges. So can you give an example to a grand challenge and how firms can approach to solve these kind of grand challenges? So what should we understand when we say grand challenges?
Yeah, okay, yeah. For me, grand challenges really are the sort of, very high level, complex, uncertain problems that we face, like as a society, often on a global scale. Of course, examples would be things like climate change or poverty, those kind of things. Of course, the current pandemic kind of fits with such a description as well. And what's specific for grand challenges, maybe relative to other types of problems that we may face, is that indeed they are very, say, ill-defined as well, in the sense that we don't fully understand all the aspects of the problem. And there is not even one single best solution for it. And often they need more systemic, they're more systemic in a way. So if you think of things like climate change and sustainability, of course, we may know many things that we would need to do in order to overcome that kind of challenge. But to actually implement that kind of change is difficult, because it is so, things are so embedded in the ways that we work, on a global scale, but on a national scale and on an organizational scale as well. And the point with these grand challenges then also becomes that in order to really fully comprehend them, ultimately address them, almost by definition requires a more open and collaborative innovation approach, because these challenges are so big that no single organization, or maybe even country sometimes, can actually solve them. So it's really about, how do you sort of, adjust different kinds of innovation processes on different levels and align them in order to collectively try to address those kind of challenges. And maybe, in the COVID-19 situation, you actually seen some examples where, suddenly there's more collaboration possible, because there is this really push for doing that. But another example that allows me to maybe bring it more back to a certain organization is when I was working in Copenhagen in Denmark. I also work with the Carlsberg, the company, the beverage company. And the interesting thing is that one case that I looked at is that they were interested in, they have this sustainability program, and one thing they wanted to do is is develop a sustainable bottle. So it had nothing to do with the beers they manufacture or the non-alcoholic beverages, but they had this idea, you know, can we not develop a bottle that is biodegradable, so that, you know, we don't have, you know, those bottles, you know, in sort of contributing to waste and so on. It's interesting, I think, because it's a very long-term perspective. It's also something that is outside of the scope of the company. You know, there's not their core business is, you know, to develop bottles, you know. And also what they did is that they basically had this very sort of, you know, open and proudly found elsewhere mindset, in the sense that they were, you know, actively asking for help with this. They said, you know, we have this idea, this vision, you know, who can help us to make it happen? And that's not that common, right? That as a company you would admit, okay, you know, we want to do something, but we cannot do it ourselves. Often you would rather do the opposite. But here they sort of embrace that kind of openness and manage with, you know, with a number of partners to actually develop a bottle that you know, that is almost fully biodegradable. And then now they are sort of developing, okay, what can we do with that? You know, they don't want to produce these bottles, but, you know, then they're working with their partners to try to roll out that as a solution, you know, and that's just one of the solutions, you know, to tackle sustainability issues, of course. But this really comes back to this idea of open innovation, because it's very much about the organization, you know, having the right culture, as we just talked about, but also having a kind of, you know, approach to governance that allows you to do that. You know, that, you know, you know, from a governance structure point of view, and I will not, you know, not tell, you know, not able to tell all the details, but they had really a particular way of working that allowed them to have the long-term perspective. Like often family businesses, for example, also have really say, you know, we want to do something that helps us to be around in many years from now. So having that kind of, you know, also strategic orientation, having the kind of governance and organizational structure really allowed them to do that. So there are really these organizational attributes that allows you to do that, and that is just one example of how that would fit together.
Mm-hmm. Marcel, actually, I mean, our time is up, but I would like to ask you one quick question. So sure. When we talk about those grand challenges and approach to open innovation, does it change culture to culture? For example, Japanese culture and the Western culture, I mean, do they approach it the same, or are there some differences?
Well, I mean, I think we need more research on that, to be honest. But I mean, I definitely think there are differences there, right? Because also national culture has an impact on organizational culture as well. So, and you know, in early research, I think we also have seen really, you know, like with the Japanese culture, for example, you know, in terms of knowledge sharing and those things, really, you know, fundamental differences. So I mean, I'm not totally on top of all the research that is going on in that sense, but I would definitely imagine that those kind of higher level issues, such as culture in this case, really matter. And indeed, I think we need to consider all of these levels, because together, I think this will allow us to also really, you know, solve some of these large challenges that we face.
Marcel, actually, there is another question on large challenges. One listener is asking, can we change the government politics application and maybe elections? I mean, current, you know, it's a very salient issue right at the moment, how the democracy works. Can we also approach it as a grand challenge and work with open innovation?
Yes, I mean, well, I don't think we should go maybe too much into all the details of the politics. I mean, there's also not enough time for that. But yes, I mean, open innovation has also been applied, you know, to the public sector and to governments, for example. And there's some really interesting research in that domain as well, and some interesting initiatives. How indeed, for example, you know, you can sort of increase, you know, certain democratic principles by also allowing citizens to be part of some of the government processes and having, you know, we talk about crowdsourcing, you can also have like citizen sourcing. Those are examples that are happening and that people are also looking at in practice. So definitely, yes, I think some of these principles can really help, I think, to improve some of these processes also in democratic and government processes. So that's a very valid question in that sense. Yeah.
Okay, Marcel, thank you so much. We are over our time. It was It was a very joyful and great conversation with you and a great presentation. Thank you for joining us today at this conference, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Yes, likewise. And have a nice day. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.